Everyone laughed when Daniel said he had fallen in love with a homeless woman. Friends who had known him for decades thought he had finally lost his mind. Complete strangers shook their heads whenever they saw him stop his luxury SUV beside the same weathered park bench every evening. They called her a nobody. They called her forgotten. They said she was just another face the city had learned to ignore. But they were all looking at the wrong story. Because the woman sleeping beneath a threadbare blanket on that freezing sidewalk was carrying a secret worth billions of dollars, and the man willing to sit beside her in the cold was about to uncover a truth that would force an entire city to question everything it believed about wealth, family, and the meaning of home. Before this story reaches the moment that left even experienced reporters speechless, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first glance, this looked like an ordinary story about compassion. It wasn't. Every conversation Daniel shared with the quiet woman would unlock another piece of a mystery that had remained unsolved for years. Every answer seemed to create an even bigger question. And by the time the final piece fell into place, the people who had mocked him would wish they had paid closer attention from the very beginning. Who was this mysterious woman, really? Why had the daughter of one of America's wealthiest business families disappeared without a trace, while private investigators searched across the country for years? Why was someone who had grown up surrounded by unimaginable luxury now sleeping on a public bench where thousands walked past her every day without recognizing her face? More importantly, why did she refuse every opportunity to return to the life that had once belonged to her? Newspapers had written stories. Television stations had aired emotional interviews. Rumors spread from one neighborhood to another. Some believed she had died. Others believed she had changed her identity and started over somewhere far away. A reward worth millions had quietly remained available for information leading to her whereabouts. Yet no one ever came forward with the truth. Then Daniel appeared, not as a detective, journalist, or wealthy businessman searching for publicity, but simply as a man who noticed another human being sitting alone in the cold. She trusted him before she trusted anyone else, and the reason would only become clear much later. To understand how an ordinary evening became the beginning of one of the most astonishing family reunions imaginable, we have to return to a bitter winter night when the temperature dropped below freezing and one simple act of kindness started changing two lives forever. Who was this mysterious woman? That question stayed with everyone who crossed her path, yet no one ever seemed curious enough to stop and ask. The people rushing past only saw worn-out clothes, tired eyes, and a woman sitting alone with a backpack that looked as though it carried everything she owned. They never imagined that, just a few years earlier, those same hands had signed birthday cards inside one of the largest private estates in America. They never imagined that her disappearance had triggered one of the most expensive private search efforts the country had ever seen. For years, investigators followed thousands of tips. Security cameras captured brief glimpses of women who looked like her. Missing person posters appeared in airports, train stations, hospitals, and bus terminals. Every promising lead ended in disappointment. Meanwhile, the business empire her father had spent decades building continued to grow. His companies purchased office towers, shopping centers, sports arenas, and entire neighborhoods. Financial magazines described him as the man who practically owned the city, yet there was one thing all of that money could never buy. It could not tell him where his daughter had gone. Every birthday passed without a phone call. Every Christmas left one chair empty at the family table. Reporters speculated endlessly, claiming she had been kidnapped, escaped the country, or started another life under a different identity. The truth was far simpler and far more heartbreaking. She had chosen to disappear because she believed the only way to discover who genuinely cared about her was to leave behind everything that made people recognize her family name. She wanted to know whether anyone could love her without seeing the fortune attached to it. Years passed before that answer finally arrived, and it came from the last person anyone would have expected. Daniel never searched newspaper archives. He never recognized her face from old television reports. He never knew about the reward, the missing person investigation, or the billionaire desperately hoping his daughter would walk through the front door again. All he saw was a lonely woman sitting on a freezing sidewalk while everyone else pretended she didn't exist. That single decision to stop instead of walking away would begin unraveling a mystery that had remained hidden for years. But before Daniel learned the incredible truth about the woman everyone else ignored, something happened on one cold winter evening that neither of them would ever forget. Daniel wasn't looking for love. At 54 years old, he had already convinced himself that part of his life belonged in the past. Years of building a successful construction company had filled his calendar but emptied his evenings. His marriage had ended long ago, his son lived on the opposite side of the country, and most nights he found himself driving through the city with nowhere in particular to go after work. Every weekday, his route home took him past the same aging subway entrance where commuters hurried by without making eye contact with the woman sitting quietly beside the concrete wall. She was always there before sunset, feeding crumbs to a small group of pigeons that somehow seemed less afraid of her than people were. Her clothes were faded and worn from years of exposure to the weather. Her hands trembled in the freezing air, yet she never stretched them out asking for money. She never chased strangers down the sidewalk. She never raised her voice or complained about her circumstances. Instead, she simply observed the endless stream of people rushing past, almost as though she remembered belonging to a completely different world. There was something remarkably graceful about the way she carried herself despite having almost nothing. Daniel couldn't explain it, but every time he looked into her eyes, he saw someone who had experienced a life far different from the one everyone assumed she had always known. While others dismissed her as another homeless woman, Daniel noticed details that refused to fit that picture. Her words were careful whenever she quietly thanked someone for leaving behind a sandwich. She read old newspapers from beginning to end instead of only looking at the headlines. Occasionally, she would pause outside bookstore windows, studying the titles with a familiarity that suggested she had once owned libraries instead of shopping carts. Even sitting alone in the cold, she carried herself with quiet dignity that couldn't be taught or purchased. It was as if the streets had taken away her home, but had never managed to take away the person she truly was. For several weeks, Daniel simply watched from a distance, wondering what circumstances could have brought someone like her to this lonely corner of the city. Then one bitterly cold evening, with snow beginning to fall and temperatures dropping by the minute, he pulled his SUV to the curb, walked into a small coffee shop, and bought 2 hot coffees. As he approached, she looked up cautiously, expecting him to keep walking like everyone else. Daniel held out the warm cup without saying much. He expected an awkward silence, perhaps even suspicion. Instead, she accepted it with both trembling hands, looked directly into his eyes, and offered a gentle smile that carried both gratitude and sadness. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and in that single moment, without either of them realizing it, a conversation had begun that would eventually uncover one of the city's greatest hidden secrets. Days quietly turned into weeks, and before either of them realized it, weeks became months. What had begun as a simple cup of coffee on a freezing evening slowly became part of Daniel's daily routine. Every afternoon after leaving work, he found himself taking the same route through the city, knowing exactly where she would be waiting. Sometimes he brought coffee. Other days it was a warm meal from a neighborhood diner or a fresh blanket when another cold front rolled into town. At first, their conversations lasted only a few minutes, filled with polite questions and cautious answers. But as trust replaced uncertainty, those brief exchanges stretched into hours. Daniel eventually learned her name. It was Emma. The name somehow suited her, simple, elegant, and familiar. Yet everything else about her remained a mystery. She spoke with a confidence that immediately caught his attention. Her vocabulary reflected years of education, and her knowledge reached far beyond what anyone expected. She could explain the history behind famous American landmarks, discuss classical paintings hanging inside museums she claimed she hadn't visited in years, and describe business mergers as though she had once sat inside boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made. She followed politics with remarkable insight, remembering speeches, elections, and historical moments with astonishing accuracy. Daniel found himself listening far more than speaking, fascinated by how someone living on the streets possessed such remarkable understanding of the world. Every answer she gave seemed to create another question in his mind. Whenever he gently asked about her past, however, Emma's expression changed. She would smile politely, look toward the passing traffic, and redirect the conversation before revealing too much. It happened so naturally that Daniel chose to respect the boundary. He never pressured her for answers because he believed everyone carried memories they weren't ready to share. Still, small clues continued appearing when she least expected them. One afternoon, while the two of them sat on a park bench sharing sandwiches, Emma casually mentioned having watched fireworks from the balcony of a private penthouse overlooking Central Park. Another day, she described a charity gala inside one of New York's most exclusive hotels with details so vivid that Daniel wondered how she could possibly know them. She spoke about private art collections, international charity foundations, and secluded vacation estates visited only by America's wealthiest families. The moment she realized what she had revealed, she immediately fell silent and changed the subject, asking Daniel about his construction projects instead. He noticed the pattern but chose not to confront her. Deep down, he sensed there was a painful reason behind every unfinished sentence. Then, on a windy autumn afternoon, as Emma searched through her worn backpack looking for a small notebook, something slipped onto the ground without either of them noticing. Daniel bent down to pick it up. It was an old photograph, slightly faded around the edges but carefully protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. The moment he looked at it, his heart nearly stopped. Standing beside a much younger Emma, smiling in front of an enormous estate, was a man whose face appeared regularly on magazine covers, financial news broadcasts, and the front pages of business journals across America. He was one of the richest men in the country, a billionaire whose companies controlled skyscrapers, banks, shopping districts, and countless properties throughout the city. Daniel looked from the photograph to Emma, then back again, struggling to understand how the quiet woman everyone ignored outside the subway entrance could possibly be standing beside one of the most powerful businessmen in America. The answer to that single photograph would change everything he thought he knew about her. Daniel stared at the photograph for several long seconds, convinced there had to be some mistake. He looked at the smiling young woman in the picture, then at the woman sitting beside him on the park bench. The years had changed her appearance, but her eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes that had quietly thanked him for a cup of coffee on that freezing winter evening. Slowly, he turned the photograph back toward Emma without saying a word. The color drained from her face the moment she realized what had happened. For a brief moment, she reached for the picture as though she wanted to hide it forever, but then her trembling hands stopped. She closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and whispered, "I knew this day would come." Daniel didn't interrupt. He understood that whatever she was about to tell him had probably remained locked inside her heart for years. Emma held the photograph carefully, brushing away a small speck of dust with her thumb before looking at the smiling man standing beside her. It wasn't just any businessman. It was the billionaire whose name dominated financial headlines across America. His companies owned banks, hospitals, luxury hotels, sports franchises, media companies, office towers, and entire neighborhoods. Local residents often joked that if you stood anywhere in the city, chances were the land beneath your feet belonged to one of his corporations. The joke had become so common that people laughed, saying he practically owned the entire city. Yet despite all that influence, all those buildings, and all those billions of dollars, he had spent years unable to find the one person who mattered most to him. Emma finally broke her silence. Her voice was steady at first, but Daniel could hear the weight behind every word. She explained that she had been raised inside a world where private jets, charity galas, luxury estates, and boardroom meetings were part of everyday life. From the outside, people believed her family had everything anyone could ever dream of. But behind the expensive walls of their beautiful home, grief had quietly settled in after a devastating family tragedy changed them forever. The loss shattered relationships that had once seemed unbreakable. Her father buried himself in expanding his business empire, believing hard work would somehow ease the pain. Every new acquisition, every new skyscraper, every successful deal made him richer, but it also pulled him further away from the people who loved him most. Emma felt as though she had become another valuable asset in the family's public image instead of simply being a daughter longing for comfort. Everywhere she went, people recognized her family name before they recognized her. Friendships felt artificial. Invitations arrived because of wealth instead of genuine affection. Even acts of kindness often carried expectations hidden beneath polite smiles. One day, Exhausted by the attention surrounding her family's fortune, she made a decision almost no one could understand. She walked away from everything. She left behind the mansion, the luxury cars, the private security, the trust funds, and every privilege money could provide. She carried only a backpack with a few personal belongings and disappeared without telling anyone where she was going. At first, she believed living as an ordinary person would help her discover who truly cared about her. Instead, something heartbreaking happened. Once the designer clothes were gone, once the family name disappeared, and once the fortune could no longer open doors, people stopped seeing her altogether. She became invisible in the middle of crowded streets. Thousands walked past her every day without asking whether she needed help. The same society that once celebrated her family now barely acknowledged her existence. Daniel listened in complete silence, realizing that the woman everyone dismissed as homeless had spent years searching for something no amount of money could ever purchase. A single person willing to care about Emma simply because she was Emma. And without either of them realizing it, that search had finally come to an end the day he offered her a cup of coffee without asking for anything in return. Daniel sat quietly for several moments after Emma finished speaking. The city around them continued exactly as it always had. Car horns echoed through the streets. Commuters hurried toward the subway without noticing the extraordinary conversation taking place only a few feet away. It was almost unbelievable that a story capable of filling newspaper headlines was unfolding in complete silence on an ordinary park bench. Daniel finally looked at Emma and said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "The woman I came here to see every evening isn't a billionaire's daughter. She's the same person who smiled when I handed her a cup of coffee." Emma's eyes filled with tears because, for the first time in years, someone had spoken to her without mentioning her family's fortune or the empire her father had built. Daniel didn't care about the companies. He didn't care about the estates, the investments, or the billions attached to her last name. He cared about the woman who had spent months sharing stories, laughing over simple meals, and proving that kindness survives even after life takes almost everything away. In that moment, Emma realized she had finally found what she had been searching for all those years. She had found someone who saw her heart before her history. After several days of careful conversation, Emma made the decision she had avoided for years. With Daniel standing beside her, she agreed to contact her father. The phone call lasted only a few minutes, but the silence that followed on the other end spoke louder than any words. Her father could barely believe the voice he was hearing. Within hours, he arrived without reporters, without television cameras, and without the long line of executives who usually surrounded him. When he stepped out of his car and saw Emma standing there, the successful businessman the world admired disappeared, leaving behind only a father who had spent years praying for another chance. Neither of them rushed to speak. They simply embraced, holding on to one another as though they were trying to recover every lost birthday, every missed holiday, and every year that had slipped away. There were tears neither of them tried to hide. There were apologies that needed no elaborate explanation. There was forgiveness that had taken years to reach but arrived at exactly the right moment. The reunion became the beginning of healing for a family that had believed hope was gone forever. In time, Emma returned to parts of her former life, but she refused to become the person she had once been. She accepted her place in her family's future while making one promise to herself. She would never forget the people still sleeping on the same sidewalks where she had once been invisible. Using resources that had once seemed meaningless to her, she created shelters, funded outreach programs, and supported organizations helping people rebuild their lives with dignity instead of pity. Daniel remained by her side through every step, not because of the fortune she would one day inherit, but because the woman he had fallen in love with had never changed. The wealth had always belonged to her family. Her compassion belonged only to her. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. Sometimes the person wearing the oldest coat carries the richest heart. Sometimes the greatest fortune isn't measured in skyscrapers, bank accounts, or businesses spread across an entire city. Sometimes it is found in a single act of kindness offered with no expectation of anything in return. Because the richest person in the city may be the one the world mistakes for having absolutely nothing. And before you judge someone's future, remember that you rarely know the journey that brought them to where they are today. Never judge someone's story by the place you first meet them.